So I'm going to assume people know about the greenhouse effect in like some generality. So, yeah, the sort of like key mechanism people are talking about is the effect of greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide and methane reflecting back the sun's rays once it hits the earth and keeping that heat around the atmosphere, therefore heating global temperature. And this is like a graph of this global like parts per million of CO2, and this shows the main thing about this graph is like, yeah, we all know it's been going up, right? But like how quickly it's going up is the main thing. So this is sort of over 2,000 years, and you notice we're in a sort of unstable equilibrium for the whole of the time up until the Industrial Revolution, and then it just goes exponential, like this, going up at like a more and more rapid rate. Right, and this roughly correlates more or less with readings that have been going on for a long time with the global temperature, averages of global temperature in certain areas. So this is, usually people talk about the global temperature just the surface of the Earth, and they take an average, and that's what we mean when we talk about stuff like 1 degree warming, 0.5 degrees warming, and so on. So this black line tracks this, and you see how, you know, our graph before, so this starts at the Industrial Revolution-ish, or it roughly says the start of the Industrial Revolution and then tracks it going up. So before we had the carbon emissions going like this. So this is the global temperature going up in a sort of similar way. And one important point is that there's a lag called a carbon lag, about 30 years, which is like the weather and climate we experience now is the weather and climate that is the result of all of the global warming effects that happened before about 1990, because there's a 30-year lag. So the 30 years of carbon emissions we've just given, we've given out since 1990, the effects of that is in the future. In the next sort of 30 years, we will experience the effects of our carbon emissions now at 30 years in the future. Okay, and you see here, this is about 1 degree of warming. So we talk about like 1.1, about 1 degree warming since the Industrial Revolution time. So that's like this main measurement. You know, the Western scientific tradition is obsessed with finding a single measurement for something very complicated. So there's a huge reductionism here, but like this is how the global scientific community has sort of been talking about it and communicating it. And the main body that communicates that is the IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And they chose this figure of 1.5 degree, where we're supposed to keep the temperature below that. That's some kind of like magic number. It's not a magic number, right? But they just chose it because it seemed like achievable to some degree, and also wouldn't hit the really serious effects of climate breakdown, which happen after 1.5 degrees. I mean, and there's some like quibbling you can do around whether that's a good target, basically. But anyway. So as I said, like this temperature increase is an average, it's a global average. So actually, there are parts of the Earth which aren't at 1.1 degree warming since the Industrial Revolution. They're much higher than that. There's a sort of distribution of temperatures. And like, there's areas of the Earth which are in this end. So like, we've got some sort of average here of 1.1, but there's some areas which are much higher than this. And that's where you can have like, you know, huge effects of you know, people dying of heat stress and there being droughts and all this stuff, and water shortages. So that's what I mean about 1.5 is kind of like an arbitrary number, right? Because really it depends on the distribution. You've got wide-tailed distribution, you've got areas that are hit horrendously badly by the climate crisis. Okay. And just to put this in a longer perspective, like, so human beings come on the scene about, well, pick a number, like somewhere 100,000 years, something like that, 200,000 years. So since humans have been on the scene on planet Earth, we have never experienced temperatures that have gone above like about, you know, from here to here, never experienced temperatures that have gone above like maybe 1 degree. Obviously earlier on, when the kind of atmosphere was stabilising and what have you, like up here, this was like right at the start of very primitive life, 500 million years ago, basically no life on Earth. Like huge sort of unstable shifts. Then it starts gradually decreasing, making more and more complex forms of life possible. But the main point is like human beings have never experienced more than 2 degrees warming for 130,000 years, and never experienced more than 4 degrees, which is about like one of the projections the IPCC has for several million. But like all of this is not irrelevant. I'm not going to say irrelevant, but the main point is when we talk about all these numbers, that it goes back to what we said at the start about emotion and connection to what's really happening. What's really happening is that people are already dying, right? And we mustn't forget that. People are being hit largely in the global south, parts of Africa and Asia, and there's with increasing regularity, and indeed for this is happening with some regularity for hundreds of years, to be honest. Parts of the world have been fighting ecocide and environmental destruction for hundreds of years. But even in the last year, which we've got a few examples here, throughout this summer, for example, there was water shortages in Somalia, Zimbabwe, India, Pakistan. Maybe like the only one that was reported on widely was India. There was this huge heat wave in India in about May. And there was also a heat wave in France. And I remember we had all this reporting on France, right? And it was about 1,000 people died of heat related death or heart conditions in France. But what wasn't reported on was the heat wave in India and Pakistan. So temperatures in France were above 40 degrees or something. In India and Pakistan, it's about 52 degrees. And I was trying to find a figure, how many people died in Pakistan, for example. And fact was there was no data point for this. There were so many deaths in that heatwave period that the government in Pakistan was digging mass graves. And it wasn't in the media at all, no one knew about it. There's also examples here in March and April. There was two main events in Mozambique. Cyclone Ida came back twice, killed over 1,000 people, and the communities in Mozambique still haven't rebuilt at all. There's also wildfires in California and floods. There was actually floods in India and Pakistan immediately after this heat wave. And there's also a bunch of effects happening locally in the UK. I'm trying to remember the numbers exactly, I always forget this. But we've had something like 18 of the hottest 20 summers in the last since 1990. So of all the summers we've ever had, the hottest, or I think it was 15 of the hottest 20 have all been in the last 30 years. Also, there was an article in The Guardian last week which had this statistic, incredible statistic, that if you're under the age of 34, you've never experienced a single month of below average temperatures. So below average meaning of, since records began of measuring temperature in the UK, never been below the average if you're below the age of 34. Okay, I'm going to skip a few now, because we haven't got too much time. Okay, and one thing to say, so this is more like the stuff that maybe isn't as widely understood in the media, and it's also related to some of the, maybe a slight kind of critique of the IPCC report in its tendency towards kind of conservatism. The IPCC is an organisation of some climate scientists and politicians who advise them that make these sort of big papers that have to be kind of agreed on in committees. However, there's a bunch of things that they don't really talk about, and one of the main ones is what we call amplifiers or feedback loops, and related to that something called tipping points. So this one's a bit more technical, but basically there's a bunch of scientific papers that have talked about the interrelations between loads of different parts of the world's climatic system. So this could be like the coral reefs, the polar ice caps, Greenland ice sheet, the Amazon, all these key kind of climatic features, the jet stream, all these things that sort of define the main parts of the global climatic system and ecology. And they've started to find these sort of relationships between them, that if one of them goes out of sync, it affects all of them. And that if one of them reaches certain points, like tipping points, the effects can have this sort of runaway nature. So the best known example is of the ice melting, the ice caps melting, where it's something called the albedo effect, which is this feedback loop. So if the temperatures increase, ice melts faster. As ice melts, there's less white on the surface of the Earth, because ice is white. That ice should reflect sunlight, because it's white, but it melts, so it's gone. So the ocean absorbs that heat, which melts the ice more, because the ice is surrounded by warmer water. So that thing is like a negative feedback loop, if you like, or a positive one, which is how you define it. But it happens at a faster and faster rate, which is why all of our predictions of how fast ice is melting are always underestimating how fast it's melting. The actual curves of ice melting are like going like this, or like this, where the volume is going down at a really rapid rate in time. And another process that isn't really talked about in the IPCC report, because it hasn't been observed in the past, is and there's a bunch of these, but I don't have time to talk about them. But one of them is methane in the ice. So climate scientists call this the methane dragon, because it's like this huge sort of threat, like this lurking threat in our global climatic system, where there's all this methane, which is a much worse greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide, that is sort of buried in these permafrost, like these permanent ice sheets under the Arctic and Greenland and like eastern Siberia. And there's more and more data in the last few months about this methane, and there was a report this week where they looked at this eastern Siberian ice sheet in the Arctic Circle, which you can see all the methane like bubbling and coming out, and you see it like coming out of the ice. And the predictions in the IPCC report about this were like, this might start happening in about 2060, 2070. So this is the kind of stuff that's going on. There's a good paper that sort of relays or sort of talks about all of this stuff, which I can give you a reference to, called Earth Trajectories in the Anthropocene, by these sort of 4 authors. And they talk about this thing called the hothouse Earth, which is where we hit tipping points and the feedback loops of these climatic events start getting worse and worse and worse at a runaway rate, and we reach a thing called the hothouse Earth, which is where the Earth's just sort of like in a permanent state of climate like disequilibrium, where it just gets worse and worse. And they sort of model this in various ways. Okay, so I'm going to skip a few more now. So there's quite a bit I haven't said about ecology, and I'm not going to say much about it because we haven't got too much time again. And so there's stuff, loads of things talk about the soil, the oceans, agriculture, acidification, destruction of coral reefs, biodiversity loss. It's like obviously a massive subject, but all I'll remind people of is, where is it? This. So, one of the motivations for the name Extinction Rebellion was that scientists have been talking about how we're now living in the age of the 6th mass extinction. So there have been 5 other mass extinction events, the last one being like the meteorite that killed the dinosaurs. This time, we're in the 6th mass extinction event, and species are dying off now at the same rate as they did during the time of the dinosaurs dying out. But we're the meteorite. So there was this report on biodiversity loss where this sort of these extinction rates are talked about. And this is just really this blows my mind every time I look at it. This was like when human beings kind of like were on the scene, when the start of the agricultural revolution, where 99% of biomass, like the mass of all living beings, whatever, was wild animals, and only 1% was humans. Whereas today, 36% of humans, we've turned 60% of the biomass into livestock for us to eat, and 4% into wild animals in 10,000 years, which is a blink of an eye in sort of geological time. Or what? Okay, cool. not cool, sorry. That's the wrong thing to say. Like, obviously this is, so we put it here, like this is, sorry. Oh, can't go back. Yeah, I'll show you that. Yeah, and this is obviously like, we have this slide saying that it's like sort of biting the arm that feeds you, right? Like, we depend on biodiversity, we're not separate to the ecosystems that we live beyond with. We're not above them, we need them, and we're all connected to them. Okay, so usually we break there, but I'm going to just do a few more slides before we swap and maybe have a little break of like 1 minute. Okay, so I'll motivate a little bit this sort of like second half of the talk. You know, we kind of phrase this in like a moral way, really. So what do we need to do? Like, why should we act? Why should we care? What are the motivations to act? So one thing to say here is like not acting. Sort of moral philosophers have known this for a long time. Like choosing not to act on something is itself a form of action. It's a decision, right? So not doing anything about this is a moral decision. And like you might talk about here some moral obligations we have. So to other living beings, to future generations, to ourselves, and to other living beings. But also, like usually, there's not the slides aren't in this talk in this version. But I think it's really important to talk about here is our obligation, as we mentioned earlier, to those who are dying right now, and that we need to centre those people and remember that we're actually pretty lucky at the moment, right? Really lucky at the moment, in every sense, you know, and to remember that, you know, for the Western tradition, like the Western countries are like talking about it all the time now. But as I said earlier, a lot of communities around the global south, vulnerable frontline communities, have been fighting this for generations, and it's all connected. And in the original IPCC meetings of like all the world's countries, it was countries in the global south that were saying, no, not 1.5 degrees, we should be below 1 degree, because we're already at 1 degree and people are already dying. We talked about, for example, the Pakistan, the deaths from heat there. That stuff's like, why isn't that talked about, right? Because it doesn't fit with this idea that, it'll only get bad when we go past 1.5 degrees. So we have, I think, the biggest moral duty is to those people, and also to remember, particularly in the UK context, that the UK has the second highest historical emissions per person. It kick-started the Industrial Revolution. It was the sort of template for modern colonialism, in the fact that the British Empire kind of led that sort of after the. There was obviously a very different flavour from the imperialism and colonialism of the Spanish and Portuguese after the sort of Age of Exploration. The British Empire really carved out how you go around the world and extract minerals, metals from the global south, and then bring them back and sell them and become rich yourself. And I have this. I was looking up some stuff about this. Start of the Industrial Revolution. The UK obviously builds its wealth off this. In 1770, £4 million was invested into the steam industry in this country, and that money was sort of broken down. Where do we get this £4 million to invest into the steam industry? £3.8 million came from slavery and colonial debt tax collection. People estimated recently that just in India, for example, the British Empire was responsible for extracting around something like 50 trillion pounds of wealth from India during their occupation, the colonial occupation of India. And at a modern level, we like to think that this era is long gone, but of course it isn't. At the modern stage, right now today, 50% of global emissions come from extractive industries. Extractive industries being ones like the ones that make your mobile phones, extracting minerals and metals from countries mainly in Africa and Asia, where we dig these up, we mine, we often incite civil wars, like in the Congo, for instance, during the 90s. There was this coltan mines that were inciting part of the civil war in the Congo. Incidentally, Congo had the second biggest rainforest in the world until the late 1800s, when they were colonised by the Belgians, where the Belgians obviously forced them to work on mines and destroyed the rainforest there. So all these things are connected and related and are very important to remember, I think. So that's 50% of global emissions is a direct result of the sort of neo-colonial extraction of resources that's still going on today in the global south.
Climate summits, and these have been going on for about 30 years. The IPCC was founded about 30 years ago, but actually since then, half of the total greenhouse emissions have been emitted in the last 30 years since that IPCC was formed. So it kind of proves that this kind of thing isn't working. And there has been things happen locally as well, like in this country, but again, it's clearly not working. And this graph kind of proves that. So you can see here where the IPCC was founded and how much it's gone up since then.
It's all right, Paul.
It's not, well, it's not quite. And so this hasn't worked because there's a lot of structural problems. The short-termism of democracy, so the fact that we have like a 4-year government, so it's all very well and good, one government coming in and saying they'll make changes, but in 4 years they could be kicked out, and then whoever the opposition that comes in obviously don't have to follow through on those. And also then in the democratic process there's a lot of like oil companies and banks that lobby the democratic process, and they obviously don't want to solve this issue because they make a lot of money out of it. Capitalism fails to project and sustain for our future. There's a real thing of economic growth which doesn't take into account the environment. Economists don't internalise the externalities of the environment, so they don't consider that when they're talking about economic growth, because it's just not something that's that they're just not deemed important. And also the action needs to be global, so it needs to happen across countries, and that's not currently happening either. So we need a radical change. This is a Banksy that was actually painted at Marble Arch during the Extinction Rebellions, and that's what XR are trying to do. So we need a radical and somewhat new approach. They've done what we're trying to do, the civil disobedience, in much harsher conditions, and like it's been tougher for them, definitely. And it's also really important to know that 200 climate activists are killed daily around the world for being climate activists, mainly in kind of other countries where it's really much tougher conditions and it's not as accepted to care about this kind of thing. So Extinction Rebellion do civil disobedience. And these are kind of the elements of what that means. So for instance, like this week in London, there have been thousands and thousands of people who have descended on the streets. Focus on the capital city, so we were right outside Westminster, and there were 11 sites that were initially blocked by XR, and they were all surrounding Westminster and all in kind of places that were important to the government, that were going to kind of get that kind of that attention from them. And it has been disruptive, so like I said, we were outside Westminster, we blocked the roads, blocked some of the bridges, and this is based in like the social science research that these actions do work, and obviously not perfect, but there is a lot of useful things in them that XR have taken. And also it's fun, and it's non-violent is also the very important thing to say. So there's no, that makes it accessible, so that it's not just angry people that would cause any violence. It's a movement that is open to everybody. The fact that it's non-violent means that people can be a part of it in like a safe way. And yeah, so this week there has been a lot of fun things happening. So although there was like, so we were blocking the roads and stuff, one example is we were outside Westminster Abbey, and it was like we blocked the roads, we were all tense and stuff, and then out of nowhere 4 men dressed as kangaroos appeared, And like they were like 7 foot and they had like bouncy like pogo stick stilts on, and it was just really bizarre, but they were like with XR and it was just hilarious. Like it was quite a low day and everyone was feeling a bit down, I think, and then these 4 kangaroos appeared and it just like changed the atmosphere completely. So it also shows that that kind of thing works. It gets people talking, and obviously the more conversation around this kind of thing is better. So it's formed about a year ago, and then in April the first rebellion happened in London. So there were lots of, they blockaded the bridges, and from that the government did declare a climate emergency, but not what just happened on that, which is why the rebellions happened in October as well. And currently I think there's about 60 countries where action is taking place across the world, so it's not just in England. There we go, you can see all the places that Extinction Rebellion has reached. And yeah, these are some of the things that have been done with Extinction Rebellion. Skip that. So there's 3 demands for Extinction Rebellion. The first one is that the government should tell the truth about the climate emergency. So that kind of starts with them declaring a climate emergency, but also like now we need, and then that leads on to the second demand of they need to act on it. We need net zero emissions by 2025, which is obviously quite soon. And then third is citizens' assemblies, which I'll kind of explain a little bit more later on. And then there is also a 4th demand, which kind of came into Extinction Rebellion from the American groups, which is about kind of recognising like indigenous populations and like the kind of like Benji was saying about climate justice, and kind of acknowledging that people have done this before and that they are the people that a lot of the time are affected more by this. So that's something to think about.
Yeah, I think that there's a People's Assembly in London like today, where they're like deciding to clarify exactly what that 4th demand is, and it will be a 4th demand officially soon.
So why 25? Because if we wait until 2050, there's kind of 3 points that why we shouldn't wait until 2050. So the first is that it ignores the fact that Britain has had a historical role in leading the Industrial Revolution. We have the 2nd highest rate of emissions per person, so we can't wait until 2050 to solve that. It's also based on the 50-50 probabilities from the IPCC report. So by waiting until 2050, it only gives like a 50-50 chance of staying below 1.5 degrees. And it's quite a conservative estimate as well. And it doesn't really acknowledge the threat of tipping points. So we can't wait. And also, like, you wouldn't... Next slide. Oh. Is what I just said. So yeah, you wouldn't, if you were driving off a cliff, you wouldn't wait until you got to the edge of the cliff to press your brakes. So, because wouldn't consider what the brakes don't work, or like the cliff edge is closer. So why would we wait until 2050 to solve these issues? We need to solve them now, and by 25 kind of means now, because that is really soon, and that's what we need to do. And also, like Benji said, people are already dying. We need to solve that. So, citizen assemblies. It's kind of like jury duty in that it's a random selected group of people, and they come together and they're given like information, like speak to experts, and then are kind of given the so they then kind of decide on what needs to happen. And it's like the government have to act on it, it's not like advisory. So that's kind of how that works on this little graph. It's a really good example of participatory democracy as well. So while this thing of citizens' assemblies is specific to climate change, it could be like a bit of a democratic revolution in how we make decisions in the future, because the current system doesn't really work. it has worked in other countries as well. It's how in Ireland it was what they did before the abortion ban was lifted, and that was kind of how they came to that decision. Yeah, also, just to expand on that a little bit, obviously, a Citizens' Assembly is free from the 4-year structure of our current democracy, free from corporate influences, and yeah, has been effective before, so it's a model that we could move towards. Okay, so how does Extinction Rebellion work? Absolutely non-violent. So again, that kind of allows it to be an accessible movement for everybody. Decentralised. So although there's groups all over the country, but all the groups are able to be autonomous and work on their own backs. There's national working groups, and they kind of like control different things like finance and media, etc. And then there's local groups as well. So for instance, like we have the Liverpool local group, and we choose what we can do locally, and then there's actions organised on a national level like London, but then the local groups kind of can stay together and form affinity groups, and then within those groups choose what they want to do. So there isn't a leader as such, it's a decentralised model. This is kind of like meant to show that was a very confusing little graph, so I'm not really going to go into that because I feel like it would take a long time. And also we have a regenerative is that the right word? Culture. So that's just about like supporting each other and making sure that people don't burn out, and just generally being nice and like just making sure that people are okay and that they're doing well. So yeah, checking in with people. A lot of the time at meetings, like we just kind of check in with your neighbour, make sure they're okay, all that kind of stuff. Nice things. So the main thing that we do are actions, which is what's currently happening in London. And so these aren't Liverpool, but actions that we've done in Liverpool. We did a roadblock on Man Island a few weeks ago now. There was also a die-in underneath when the cathedral had the earth in. There was a die-in underneath that, so loads of people did that, which was really nice. And there's other things that we've done locally as well. And then there's the national ones, so obviously currently in London, there's a huge national action.
After April, then there's huge public interest in XR, we assume that the same thing will happen now. There is a whole thing about people putting themselves forward to be arrested, and that's absolutely not a central thing to be part of XR. Some people will get arrested because civil disobedience involves breaking the law, but there's also those roles where you won't get arrested, you won't be at risk of that, and you actually don't have to be. And again, that's something that can make it accessible for everybody. And some of the other things that you can do are these kind of things. So obviously, there's banners and you can do art. There's social media elements, so you can do that kind of thing. And just generally media presence and support, so that if people are arrested, we have to support media and that kind of thing. Obviously there's a lot of reasons to get involved. Personally, I feel like it's been backed up and do something now, and that's why we want to do that. The cause and change. We've done a committee here on today. Our local meetings are the first Monday of every month and the third Wednesday at Wood, which is on Extinction Street, kind of like the London Road, and Thursday and Saturday Road general meetings, and then obviously we do those as well.
Talks about the civil resistance model. Like there's this sort of like two different logics going on now, where and there's like two different groups of people who look like they were disagreeing with each other, but it's like one of these things where they're not really disagreeing, you can just do both. So like some people, like the main philosophy was like this civil resistance thing where you're like there, present, visible, everyone can see you get loads of media attention, even if people are annoyed at you for disrupting things. So you go to London, you like camp out. So in April we were at these 4 sites, everyone sees you, you're like there in the street, you're a presence. So that was like one logic, and that sort of was like the civil resistance model logic. The other logic is more of like the direct action logic, which is where you go to corporations and you do actions there and you target the actual perpetrators of the climate crisis. So this week, we really saw that those two things, doing both of them at the same time and in a really dynamic, fluid kind of a way, that's sort of organised through this autonomous decision-making process where we started off with these 12 sites, but they were all like autonomous to make decisions, generally through these things called people's assemblies. And they can decide whether they want to go to somewhere else, merge the sites with another site, so gradually the sites all merged, changed, and we're there for a couple of days, and then like the northern groups were like, okay, we've been here for a couple of days, we'll merge over here so we can send a load of people to go to the banks. So today, all the Liverpool rebels and other groups are at the Bank of England doing actions, are in the financial district, because banks are obviously funding the climate crisis to a huge degree. And there's this general oil and gas conference on Friday. There's genuinely a conference last week called the Oil and Money Conference. Where it's £4,000 a ticket. The CEOs of Shell, Total, BP, ExxonMobil were all there, and Saudi oil barons in the Intercontinental Hotel in London. Absolute disgrace. So there was actions there, obviously. Actually, I don't want to tell this a bit sensitive. I tried to get in on Thursday, to try and be a waiter, but it was a bit of an imbroglio. Like, it didn't really work. It was like a comedy sketch. But anyway, but there was all these satellite actions. The sites kept moving and flowing, and it was like this quite exciting sort of evolving strategy that isn't just about this stereotypical like just blocking roads, disrupting normal people's lives. Like we were in the heart of government, and we were targeting the corporations at the same time. So we were visible, but also sending a message about what the problems are. So that was like my spiel.